You are naked right now, not literally, but in every way that actually matters. Psychologically, historically, existentially, whatever you're wearing, it isn't protecting you from the cold. It's protecting you from something far more terrifying than that. And the moment our ancestors first reached for something to cover themselves, that was the moment they stopped being animals. Or maybe that was the moment the real horror began. Picture this. It's 170,000 years ago, East Africa. The planet has just lurched into one of its coldest, most hostile phases, a glacial period so severe that our entire species shrinks to just a few thousand individuals, barely enough to survive, barely enough to matter. There are no cities, no shelters made of brick or glass. There is only the wind, the cold, and the quiet, terrifying intelligence of a creature who had just enough brain to understand how completely, totally exposed it was. That creature was us. Now, here's what most documentaries tell you. Early humans started wearing clothes because it was cold, simple, functional, survival. And that's true, partially. But that answer always bothered me. Because here's the thing, dozens of other species survived ice ages without clothes. Bears, wolves, mammoths. They had fur, yes, but they also had something else. Something we don't talk about enough. They didn't know they were naked. We did. Genetic scientists working backward through lice DNA of all things have pinpointed when humans first started wearing clothes to somewhere between 83,000 and 170,000 years ago. They tracked body lice, because body lice can only survive on clothing. When body lice evolved from head lice, that's when clothing appeared. Think about that. We know when we first covered ourselves because of the parasites that followed us into our clothes. Even our timeline of shame was written in something that fed on us. But here is where the story takes its first strange turn. Because the timing doesn't quite fit the climate. Clothing appears in the fossil record, or rather, the parasite record during a period that was cold, yes, but not devastatingly cold, not survival at all costs cold. Other hominid species in the same conditions didn't develop clothing. They didn't need to. So why did we? This is the question nobody really answers, and the answer is disturbing. When anthropologists study early human clothing, not just when it appeared, but how they find something strange. The first clothes weren't designed for maximum warmth. They weren't optimized for survival in the way you'd expect from a desperate species just trying to stay alive. The early evidence suggests something more deliberate, more ritualistic. Skins prepared with ochre red pigment, deliberately shaped, worn in ways that suggest presentation, that suggest an audience. We didn't just cover ourselves, we displayed ourselves. But then something strange happened, something that no survival theory can fully explain. We started covering the parts of our bodies that generate the most heat, our core, our genitals, areas that, from a purely thermal perspective, should stay uncovered first and covered last. Basic physics of body heat says cover your extremities, your feet, your hands. Instead, we covered our centers, our middles, our most private places. And we did this before we covered our feet. Before we covered our heads. Thermal logic would never predict this order. Psychological logic does. Because what we were covering wasn't skin. We were covering something deeper, something invisible, something that only a creature with self-awareness could possess. We were covering our sense of self. Across virtually every human culture on Earth, including those that developed in complete isolation from each other, on opposite sides of the planet, clothing is tied to something beyond temperature. It is tied to shame, to status, to identity, to power. The Amazon tribes, who have lived in extreme equatorial heat for thousands of years, they wear almost nothing for warmth, but they still wear something, always. Because what they're wearing isn't about the body, it's about the self. In one study of remote indigenous cultures, researchers found that even in climates where nudity is practical and common, every single culture had some form of adornment or covering that marked identity, status, or ritual transition. Not one culture on Earth has ever chosen to remain completely unadorned. Let that sink in. 6 continents, thousands of cultures, thousands of years of independent development, and every single human group, without exception, decided that being physically bare was somehow incomplete. But that wasn't the worst part. Because clothing didn't just change how we looked, it changed how we thought. There is a concept in psychology called enclothed cognition. The idea that what you wear doesn't just change how others see you, it changes how you see yourself, how you think, how you perform, how you feel about your own capability. In a famous study, people wearing a white lab coat, just a coat, nothing else different, performed significantly better on tests requiring attention and precision. When told the coat belonged to a doctor, they performed even better than when told it belonged to a painter. Same coat, different story, different brain. Our ancestors didn't just invent clothing. They invented a technology for reshaping their own psychology. And this is the part almost nobody talks about. Because once you understand that clothing was never primarily about warmth, you have to ask a much more uncomfortable question. If we were covering ourselves for psychological reasons, for shame, for identity, for power, then what exactly were we ashamed of? What did we suddenly see about ourselves that needed hiding? What changed? This is where we have to talk about the most unsettling possibility in this entire story. Around the same time, clothing appears in the fossil record 100,000 to 200,000 years ago. Something else appears. Something that archaeologists call a constellation of behaviors that, for some reason, emerged all at once. Burial of the dead, ritual ochre markings, long-distance trade, symbolic thought, and clothing. All of it appearing in roughly the same window of prehistory. Not because the climate changed, not because food became scarce, but because something shifted inside the human mind itself. We became self-aware. And with self-awareness came something that no other animal has ever had to carry. The knowledge that we are temporary, that we are small, that we are, beneath all our complexity, just meat on a rock floating in an indifferent universe. Terror management theory, one of the most powerful frameworks in all of social psychology, argues that virtually everything humans do is, at some level, a response to that terror. The terror of knowing we are mortal. The terror of knowing we are, in cosmic terms, nothing. Art, religion, status, achievement, legacy, family, and clothing. All of it, a way of saying, I am more than this body. I am more than this flesh. I am something that cannot be undone by time. The first human who wrapped themselves in animal skin wasn't just trying to stay warm. They were doing something philosophically profound, something almost unbearably human. They were refusing, for the first time, to be just an animal. But here's the thing about refusing to be something. It only works if you're terrified that you already are it. Look at yourself right now. Whatever you're wearing, expensive, cheap, deliberate, thrown on it, is a story you are telling, not to the world, to yourself. You chose it. Even if you think you didn't, even if you grabbed the first thing off the floor this morning, that choice is a self-statement so deeply embedded in your psychology that you can't switch it off. You can't opt out. This is why solitary confinement is so psychologically devastating. Not just the isolation, but the uniform. The elimination of self-expression through clothing is one of the most efficient ways to destroy a person's sense of identity. Prisons have known this for centuries. Cults use the same technique. Clothes aren't what we wear. They're one of the primary ways we tell ourselves that we exist. Think about the moments in life when clothing changes. When we dress for a wedding, for a funeral, for a first day of school, for a job interview, for a first date. These aren't arbitrary rituals. They are ceremonies of identity transition. We are saying, I am entering a new chapter of who I am. I am marking this moment on my body. I am making the invisible, the psychological shift, visible. Even grief changes what we wear. Across most cultures in human history, mourning clothes exist. Black, white, gray. The removal of jewelry. The deliberate suppression of adornment. Because adornment is self-assertion. And grief, at its core, is a temporary suspension of self. We even die a little in what we wear. But here is the twist in the reframe that I can't stop thinking about. If clothes are a psychological technology we invented to cope with self-awareness, to manage the existential terror of being mortal, conscious, fragile creatures, then what does it mean that we've made that technology into an obsession? The global fashion industry is worth over $2 trillion. $2 trillion, more than the GDP of most countries on Earth. We spend more money on what we wear than on education in many parts of the world. We are, as a species, spending extraordinary resources on the thing we invented 100,000 years ago to cope with the fact that we knew we were going to die. The cope became the culture, and we are so deep inside it now that we can no longer see the original terror it was built to cover. Just like the first piece of animal skin, wrapped around a trembling body on a dark African plain, not to keep out the cold, to keep out the dark.